10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill was already known as a house where murder had been committed when Beresford Brown moved in as a tenant in 1951. In December 1949, police had found the strangled bodies of 20-year-old Beryl Evans and her daughter, Geraldine Evans, aged 13 months, in the outhouse in the backyard. Beryl's husband, Timothy, was subsequently hanged for murder. Yet everyone needs a roof above their heads, and otherwise the house fitted the bill. Certainly, with post-war housing shortages, there was no lack of tenants, despite the crowded condition of the little house and the high rents demanded by the landlord. When Beresford Brown entered the little kitchen, which adjoined the back garden, he had no idea that he was about to make a terrible discovery that would cause reverberations on a national scale. As he later stated, "I was going to fix some shelves in the kitchen and knock the wall first above what appeared to be a door, and then just at the top of it appeared to be hollow. I then took a torch and tore the top corner of the paper away. I shone my torch through the hole I had made and saw the back of somebody's body. I called another tenant and we fetched the police." Ivan Williams, a fellow tenant, left the house and found a public telephone box at the corner of nearby St. Mark's Road. It was about 5 o'clock that evening when he made the call and then went back to await the police's arrival. P.C. Leslie Seisman was one of the first policemen on the scene. Entering the kitchen, he saw a little more of what Brown had found. "I could see the body of a woman in a sitting position, back to the opening with her head and shoulders hunched. This was clearly murder." Chief Inspector Albert Griffin of F Division from Hammersmith Police Station arrived to take charge, and he summoned Dr. Francis Camps, 1905-72, a pathologist. They were to make worse discoveries. The small recess in the kitchen yielded not just one corpse or even two, but 3. Camps reported of the corpses that one was on its back with the legs vertical against the back of the cupboard. It was wrapped in a blanket, tied round the ankles with a piece of wire, and the torso covered with earth and ashes. Another body, also wrapped in a blanket and tied round the ankles with a sock, was lying on top of the other in a similar position and also covered with earth and ashes. The third body was sitting in an upright position and kept in that position by her brassiere, to the back of which was tied the end of the blanket from the feet of the middle body. Veteran policemen were shocked at what they had found, but the house had not yielded up all its secrets, as Dr. Camps explained. Later that night, I examined the front room on the ground floor and noticed some loose boards in the middle of the room. I lifted the boards and completely buried in earth, and rubble was another body wrapped in a blanket. The police initially had no idea who the corpses were, though the first 3 were young women and the last to be found was a middle-aged woman. However, the man who might well be able to assist them was the previous tenant of these ground floor rooms, who had left the house on the 20th of March, destination unknown. The police therefore issued a description of John Reginald Halliday Christie, which was circulated to the newspapers and published on the following day. Aged 55, height 5 feet 9 in, slim build, dark brown hair thin on top, clean shaven, sallow complexion, long nose, wearing horn, rimmed spectacles, dentures top and bottom, walks with military bearing, wearing a dark blue herringbone suit, brown leather shoes, fawn belted raincoat, and brown trilby hat. On the following morning, the 4 corpses were taken to Kensington Mortuary so that Dr. Camps could perform post-mortems on them. His findings revealed that of the 3 bodies found in the kitchen recess, 2 had died in January and 1 in early March. All 3 had been gassed and raped, but the cause of death was strangulation. Each wore a type of diaper. One of the victims had an extremely large amount of alcohol in her body, another had a little, and was also found to be 6 months pregnant. The woman from the front room had been dead for rather longer. She had been strangled as well, but neither gassed nor raped. All but the most recent corpse had had their faces covered. Thankfully, the identities of all 4 victims were quickly ascertained. First, there was Kathleen Maloney, born in Plymouth in 1926 and an orphan by the age of 3. She had drifted into a life of prostitution while in her teens and had continued in this lifestyle for the remainder of her life. Her relatives did not want to know her. She had lived chiefly in London and then Southampton, giving birth to 5 children and had a long record of petty crime. In 1952, she moved to London and also made money by posing naked for photographers. She often frequented pubs near Paddington Station to pick up clients. She had last been seen just after Christmas, but no one had reported her as missing. The second victim was Rita Elizabeth Nelson, born in Belfast in 1927. Her parents had separated and she had a record of petty crime, including prostitution and theft. She had had a baby and had spent time in a mental hospital. In October 1952, she came to London with her cousin. Eventually, she rented a room in Shepherd's Bush. Although she was pregnant again, she had a variety of brief menial jobs. Her landlady reported her missing to the police at Hammersmith Police Station on the 19th of January. The third victim was Hectorina Mackay McLennan, born in Glasgow in 1926. In 1948, she and the rest of the family joined her father in London, living in Kensington. She had 2 children with a man in the Burmese Air Force. Unlike the 2 young women mentioned previously, there is no record that Hectorina was involved in prostitution, nor did she have a criminal record. Like them, though, she had a number of menial employments. In 1951-52, she was childminder for Alexander Pomeroy Baker's children, and he left his wife for her. He had not seen her since the 6th of March, 1953, but had not reported her missing because she was often known to disappear for various periods of time. Finally, the older woman was Ethel Christie, née Simpson, the wife of the missing tenant. She had been born in Halifax in 1898 and had married John Christie there in 1920. They were childless and had separated in 1923, reuniting a decade later. She had worked in a secretarial capacity but became a housewife when reunited with her husband. Neighbors in the street knew her well and knew that she had complained about being harassed by the new tenants at 10 Rillington Place. No one had seen her since before Christmas. Her husband had told neighbors that she was with relatives in Sheffield. Meanwhile, a search of the premises continued and spread to the back garden, which was strewn with rubbish. On the 27th of March, the search there began to unearth human bones. 3 days later, it was possible to reassemble these into 2 human female skeletons, though one was missing its skull. It seemed, therefore, that 6 women in all had been killed and concealed at the house, but the identity of the 2 skeletons, who clearly had lain there for some years, was initially unknown. One clue was that the skull in the garden showed indications that dentistry in Central Europe had taken place. More strange discoveries were made. One item found in the back garden was a small pastil tin, in which were 4 clumps of female pubic hair. It was never ascertained who these belonged to. Certainly they were not from any of the 4 bodies found in the house. The tin belonged to the former tenant, Christie. There was also a square glass container with a screw-top lid and 2 rubber tubes emanating from it. More pressing was the need to locate the missing former tenant. It was soon found that after leaving the house on the 20th of March, he had gone to a men's hostel called Rowton House in North London, signing in under his own name. However, he left there on the 24th of March. His relatives in the north of England were contacted, but to no avail. There were numerous sightings of him, not only in London, but throughout Britain and even abroad. The newspapers were able to have a field day with these murders and reported them with great prominence, except the Times, which only had a few paragraphs tucked inside, not giving it top billing. The Daily Mirror had headlines such as "3 Women Dead in House of Murder" and later "Race Against Time to Trap Horror Killer." The Sunday Pictorial followed suit. "Another body is found, and the house of death yields new secrets." More dramatically, the News of the World referred to the Ripper of Rillington Place, a clear comparison to the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888, and claimed he was worse than murderers John Hay or Gordon Cummins. There was also concern that there might be more murders, and this was encouraged by the press. The Sunday Pictorial claimed the sex strangler of Notting Hill may strike again, and that the murderer was one of the most dangerous of modern-time murderers. One theory argued he was mad and motivated by the phases of the moon. Since there would be a full moon on the 30th of March, then that might be when he would kill again. No woman was safe. The denouement, when it came, was an anticlimax. At about 9 o'clock in the morning of the 31st of March, P.C. Thomas Ledger, on his regular Putney beat, saw a man who looked homeless. Unshaven and unkempt, he stood by Putney Bridge, looking at a barge being loaded. Ledger recalled, "I saw a man leaning over the embankment with his hands resting on the wall itself. He was unkempt. I first noticed he was wearing glasses, and from a side view thought he resembled the man Christie." Ledger approached the man and asked, "What are you doing, looking for work?" "Yes, but my employment cards haven't come through yet." "Where are you from?" "Paddington." "What is your name and address?" "John Waddington, 35 Westbourne Gardens. Have you anything on you to prove your identity?" "Nothing at all." Ledger asked the man to remove his hat, and he complied. It was then that Ledger knew that the man before him was the man that the police were searching for. Summoning 2 other constables, they took him to Putney Police Station, and he accompanied them without any fuss. At 9:15 a.m. they arrived at the station. It is probable that Christie was pleased to be there, as he had not eaten for 4 days and had been wandering around London since leaving Rowton House a week previously. After eating breakfast, Inspector Edward Kelly asked him, "Are you John Reginald Halliday Christie?" And he agreed that he was. Christie was then told that he would be taken to Notting Hill Police Station, where he would be charged with the murder of his wife. To this he said nothing. Kelly searched him. In his wallet was his identity card, his rent book, his marriage certificate, national insurance papers, his St. John ambulance card, his trade union card, his ration book, and a news cutting about the trial of Timothy Evans, in which he had been a witness for the prosecution. His only money was a halfpenny, a 3-penny piece, and a bent florin. He was grateful to his captors, later writing, "I wish to state that I am grateful to the police in charge for the kindly way in which I have been treated at Putney Police Station. There has been no act of any kind to force me to say or do anything." Later that day, at Notting Hill Police Station, Griffin took a statement from Christie, which gave the latter's version of events as to the deaths of the 4 women whose bodies had been found in the house. He said, "My wife had been suffering a great deal from persecution and assaults from the black people in the house, No. 10 Rillington Place, and had to undergo treatment at the doctor's for her nerves. In December, she was becoming very frightened and was afraid to go about the house when they were about, and she got very depressed. On December 14th, I was awakened at about 8:15 a.m. I think it was my wife moving about in the bed. I sat up and saw she appeared to be convulsive. Her face was blue and she was choking. I did what I could to try and restore breathing, but it was hopeless. It appeared to be too late to call for assistance. That is when I could not bear to see her so. I got a stocking and tied it round her neck to put her to sleep. Then I got out of bed and saw a small bottle and a cup half full of water on a small table near the bed. I noticed that the bottle contained 2 phenobarbital tablets, and it originally contained 25. I then knew she must have taken the remainder. I got them from the hospital because I couldn't sleep. I left her in bed for 2 or 3 days and didn't know what to do. Then I remembered some loose floorboards in the front room. I had to move a table and some chairs to roll the lino back about halfway. Those boards had been up previously because of the drainage system. There were several of these depressions in these floorboards. Then I believe I went back and put her in a blanket or sheet or something and tried to carry her. But she was too heavy, and so I had to sort of half carry her and half drag her and put her in that depression and cover her up with earth. I thought that was the best way to lay her to rest. I then put the boards and lino back. I was in a state and didn't know what to do, and after Christmas I sold all my furniture. Christie appeared emotionally affected by having to recount the death of the woman he had been married to for 32 years and was crying. Yet some of his account was deceitful and self-serving. His wife had not been taking the pills that he claimed she was, and the law does not recognize mercy killing by an allegedly loving husband. He then went on to the deaths of the 3 women found in the alcove in a like manner. According to him, one evening I went up Ladbroke Grove to get some fish and chips for the animals. I had a dog and cat. On the way back on Ladbroke Grove, a drunken woman stood in front of me and demanded £1 for me to take her round the corner. I said, I'm not interested and I haven't got money to throw away. I'm not like that. I haven't had intercourse with any woman for over 2 years. My doctor will tell you that. She then demanded 30 shillings and said she would scream and say I had interfered with her if I didn't give it to her. I walked away as I am so well known round there, and she obviously would have created a scene. She came along. She wouldn't go, and she came right to the door, still demanding 30 shillings. When I opened the door, she forced her way in. I went to the kitchen, and she was still on about this 30 shillings. I tried to get her out, and she picked up a frying pan to hit me. I closed with her, and there was a struggle, and she fell back on the chair. It was a deck chair. There was a piece of rope hanging from the chair. I don't remember what happened, but I must have gone haywire. The next thing I remember, she was lying still in the chair with the rope round her neck. I don't remember taking it off. It couldn't have been tied. I left her there and went into the front room. After that, I believe I had a cup of tea and went to bed. I got up in the morning and went to the kitchen and washed and shaved. She was still in the chair. I believe I made some tea then. I pulled away a small cupboard in the corner and gained access to a small alcove. I knew it was there because a pipe burst during the frosty weather, and a plumber opened it up to mend the pipe. I must have put her in there. I don't remember doing it, but I remember pulling away the cupboard because it came away in 2 pieces. I slung her clothes in the bedroom. She started to undress before she picked up the frying pan. I put the small cupboard back. It wasn't a fixture. Let us pause for a moment to analyze this account of murder, almost certainly that of Kathleen Maloney, killed in early January 1953. Christie portrays himself as an innocent victim, as a man simply out to eat his dinner and then accosted by a drunken prostitute. Quite why he is unable to brush her off or ignore her is questionable. She then invades his home, begins to strip, and then threatens to assault him with a frying pan. Again, it is Christie who appears as the innocent victim, merely trying to defend himself. However, he omits to say what the pathologist had found out, that Kathleen had been gassed to render her unconscious and had been raped just prior to her death. It is also noteworthy that Christie has a lapse of memory which is convenient for him. To return to his statement, sometime after this, I suppose it was February, I went into a cafe at Notting Hill Gate for a cup of tea and a sandwich. The cafe was pretty full. There wasn't much space. 2 girls sat at the table and I sat opposite at the same table. They were talking about rooms where they had been looking to get accommodation. Then one of them spoke to me. She asked me for a cigarette and then started conversation. During the conversation, I mentioned about leaving my flat and it would be vacant very soon, and they suggested coming down to see it together in the evening. Only one of them came down. She looked over the flat. She said it would be suitable subject to the landlord's permission. It was then that she made suggestions that she would visit me for a few days. She said this so that I would use my influence with the landlord as a sort of payment in kind. I was rather annoyed and told her it didn't interest me. I think she started saying I was making accusations against her when she saw there was nothing doing. She said that she would bring somebody down to me. I thought she meant she was going to have some of the boys down to do me. I believe it was then that she mentioned something about Irish blood. She was in a violent temper. I remember she started fighting. I am very quiet and avoid fighting. I knew there was something. It's in the back of my mind. She was on the floor. I must have put her in the alcove straight away. This is his description of the murder of Rita Elizabeth Nelson, who was 6 months pregnant, though her death cannot have been after the 17th of January, when her landlady found her missing, and it probably took place on the 14th. Again, as with Kathleen Maloney, it is the woman who makes the advances. It is she who asks for a cigarette and makes conversation. Christie paints himself as a passive victim, both here and at his home, where it is the woman who makes suggestions of a sexual nature, and then when these are virtuously rebuffed, becomes violent. His violence towards her, as noted by the pathologist, is not mentioned. She just drops dead. The final victim's death was then recounted thus. Not long after this, I met a man and a woman coming out of a cafe at Hammersmith. If I remember rightly, I had been to sign on for national assistance benefits that day. The man went across the road to talk to a friend, and while he was away, she said they had to give up their diggings at the weekend. He was out of work. Then I told her that if they hadn't found anywhere, I could put them up for a few days. They both came up together and stayed a few days. They said they had been thrown out of their digs. I told them they would have to go as he was being very unpleasant. He told me that police were looking for her for some offense. When they left, the man said that if they couldn't find anywhere, could they come back for that night. The girl came back alone. She asked if he had called, and I said no, but I was expecting him. She said she would wait, but I advised her not to. She insisted on staying in case he came. I told her she couldn't, and that he may be looking for her, and that she must go, and that she couldn't stay there alone. She was very funny about it. I got hold of her arm and tried to lead her out. I pushed her out of the kitchen. She started struggling like anything, and some of her clothing got torn. She then sort of fell limp as I had hold of her. She sank to the ground, and I think some of her clothes must have got caught round her neck in the struggle. She was just out of the kitchen in the passageway. I tried to lift her up, but couldn't. I then pulled her into the kitchen onto a chair. I felt her pulse, but it wasn't beating. I pulled the cupboard away again, and I must have put her in there. This was the murder of Hectorina Mackay McLennan, which had taken place on the 6th of March, after she and Alexander Baker had stayed at Christie's rooms from the 5th of March. As with his earlier statements, Christie's victim is the aggressive and unreasonable one, and she is the one who initiates violence. As with Rita, she just dies without Christie doing anything to her. There is no mention of his gassing, raping, and strangling her. Christie was charged with the murder of his wife by Griffin at the police station at 3:30 p.m. that afternoon. Next day, he was brought before the West London Magistrates' Court, and so began a number of appearances in this court as a prelude to trial at the Old Bailey. Witness statements were given on these occasions, and eventually a date for the trial was set. Christie was, in the meantime, as a prisoner on remand, placed in Brixton Prison. Who exactly was Christie? John Reginald Halliday. Christie had been born in Halifax on the 8th of April, 1899, the 6th of 7 children of Ernest John Christie, a carpet designer at a local mill and Mary Hannah Christie, née Halliday, his wife. Much of what is known about his childhood comes from Christie himself in a newspaper interview published after his trial, and so is open to doubt. He claimed that he had a strict upbringing from a father whom he respected but feared, and a loving mother. He went to All Souls Church, sang in the choir, was in the Scouts, and attended school, where he did reasonably well, leaving in 1913 to work in a cinema. A neighbor later recalled that he was an ordinary, quiet boy. There was nothing extraordinary about him at all. Christie was a member of the St. John Ambulance Brigade, like his father, and had certificates to show his skill in first aid. He was also a lover of animals and cared for the animals of others. He was a keen amateur photographer and in later life, an active trade union representative who voted labor. Despite his high IQ, his intellectual tastes were lowbrow, reading the Daily Mirror and the News of the World, as well as westerns and thrillers. He was a chain smoker and was constantly visiting his doctor. Although he was a loner, he was not without a sense of humor and could be an interesting conversationalist when he chose. During the First World War, Christie served as a private in a battalion of Cock, the Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment, posted to France in April 1918. He was injured in July by a shell and mustard gas, so spent most of the remainder of the war in hospitals. He was never blinded, however, despite later claims that he was, but his vocal cords were affected, and he was able to claim a wounds pension for 2 years after the war's end. He was deemed to have had a good character when in the army. In 1919, he was employed as a clerk at Sutcliffe's Mill in Halifax and married Ethel Simpson in 1920. Christie had a criminal record dating back to 1921. In that year, he was employed as a temporary postman in Halifax. He began stealing checks and postal orders to the value of over £700 from the letters he was entrusted with delivering. Arrested, he appeared before the magistrate's court and was sentenced on the 12th of April to 3 sentences, each of 3 months, to run concurrently. The sentence was light because it was a first offense, and he bore a good character, allegedly teaching at a Sunday school. 2 years later, he was in trouble with the law again. He was staying in bed and breakfast accommodation in Halifax without having the money to pay his bill. This time at the same court, on the 15th of January 1923, he was put on probation for a year. Christie left Halifax after stealing from his parents, and after a brief spell in Manchester, he gravitated to London, where he would spend the rest of his life. He joined the RAF at Uxbridge and also worked in the Empire Cinema there. Bad health led him to leave the service. He returned to a life of crime, stealing a bicycle outside a school and taking money and other items from the Uxbridge Cinema he used to work in. Arrested in Southall Park, he was sentenced at Uxbridge Court on the 22nd of September 1924 to 9 months in Wandsworth Prison for theft, this time with hard labor. Later, Christie was employed in a number of jobs, including as an electrician and a lorry driver. In 1929, he was living with Mrs. Maud Cole and her son at 6 Almeric Road, Battersea. It seems that he was out of work on the 1st of May when the two had words. Christie struck her on the head with her son's cricket bat. He claimed that it was an accident and that he had merely been practicing his cricket, but the court deemed it a murderous attack, and he was sentenced to 6 months hard labor at Wandsworth Prison. Christie then took another job as a lorry driver, and it was then that he committed his 5th crime, stealing a motor car belonging to the company. He was apprehended in Buckinghamshire on the 23rd of October 1933 and tried to evade responsibility. As in 1924, he was taken before the Uxbridge Magistrates' Court and found guilty of theft. He was sentenced to 3 months in prison, spent in Wandsworth, as before. Christie was reunited with his wife in about 1934, and they lived together thereafter, firstly at 23 Oxford Gardens in Notting Hill, and then from at least 1937 in rooms at nearby 10 Rillington Place, eventually acquiring the 3 rooms on the ground floor in 1938. Christie was employed as a foreman at the Commodore Cinema in Hammersmith, and is not known to have committed any crimes in these years. During the first years of the Second World War, Christie was employed as a War Reserve constable at Harrow Road Police Station, where he seemed to be quite efficient, gaining 2 commendations. However, he also had an affair with a female colleague and saw prostitutes at this time. At the end of 1943, he changed jobs and began to work at Ultra Electric Limited on Western Avenue, Acton, West London, being employed as a dispatch clerk and a driver. In 1946, he was once again employed in the Postal Service, despite being sacked after his conviction for theft in 1921. In 1950, he was employed as a clerk for British Road Services, a post he held until December 1952, when he quit his job. To return to the murders, the 2 skeletons in the back garden were eventually identified. The headless victim was Muriel Amelia Eide, who had been born in 1912. She had lived in Acton and then moved to her aunt's house at 12 Roskell Road, Putney. By 1944, she was employed on the assembly line at Ultra Electric Limited. She was last seen by her aunt on the 7th of October, 1944, and was assumed to have been killed in the bombing. The other was Ruth Forst, born in 1922 in Austria, who had fled Nazi persecution to arrive in Britain in 1939. She had numerous jobs and lived in various places in England during the next few years. In 1942, she had a baby by a Cypriot waiter who was adopted. In 1943, she was employed in a munitions factory and lived in a room at 35 Oxford Gardens, not far from Rillington Place. She had been reported missing in August 1943. On the 5th of June, having been told about the 2 skeletons in the garden, Christie made another statement. "When I was in the Police War Reserve, I met an Austrian girl in the snack bar at the junction of Lancaster Road and Ladbroke Grove. I was off duty at the time, and I used to go into the snack bar to see if I could find a man who was wanted for theft. It was in the summer of 1943. I was living in the ground floor flat of 10 Rillington Place, and my wife was away in Sheffield. The only other person living in the house was a Mr. Kitchener, who lived on the first floor. The Austrian girl told me she used to go out with American soldiers, and one of them was responsible for a baby she had previously. I got friendly with her, and she went to Rillington Place with me for 2 or 3 times. I have seen photographs in a newspaper recently of a girl named Ruth Forst. I could not recognize the photograph, but I remembered that her name was Forst. I do not recognize the photograph now shown to me. She was about 24, I think. She was very tall, almost as tall as me, and I was 5 feet 9 inches. She was dark. She told me she lived in Oxford Gardens. One day when this Austrian girl was with me in the flat at No.10 Rillington Place, she undressed and wanted to have intercourse with me. I got a telegram whilst we were there saying that my wife was on her way home. The girl wanted us to team up together and go right away somewhere together. I would not do that. I got on the bed and had intercourse with her. While I was having intercourse with her, I strangled her with a piece of rope. I remember urine and excreta coming away from her. She was completely naked. I tried to put some of her clothes back on her. She had a leopard skin coat, and I wrapped this round her. I took her from the bedroom into the front room and put her under the floorboards. I had to do that because of my wife coming back. I put the remainder of her clothing under the floorboards too. My wife came home in the evening. My brother-in-law, Mr. Waddington, came with her. Mr. Waddington went back home the next day, and during the afternoon my wife went out. I think she was working at Osram's, While she was out, I pulled the body up from under the floorboards and took it into the outhouse, the wash house. Later in the day, I dug a hole in the garden, and in the evening when it was dark, about 10 o'clock I should say, I put the body down into the hole and covered it up quickly with earth. It was the right-hand side of the garden, about halfway along towards the rockery. My wife never knew. I told her I was going to the lavatory. The only lavatory is in the yard. I buried all the clothing in the garden. The next day I straightened the garden up and raked it over. There was an old dustbin in the garden with holes in it, which I used for burning garden refuse. When I was burning some rubbish, I got the idea into my head to burn the clothing, and what I could pull out, I put into the dustbin and burnt it. Months later, I was digging in the garden, and I probably misjudged where it was, or something like that. I found the skull and put it in the dustbin and covered it up. I dug a hole in the corner of the garden and put the dustbin in the hole about 18 inches down. The top of the dustbin was open, and I still used it to burn any rubbish. As with his earlier statements, Christie tries to put the blame on his victim. It is she who is making unreasonable demands on him, which he cannot comply with. It should be noted that he also implies that Ruth was a prostitute, at least part-time, and being paid by the wealthier American servicemen, and that she had a baby by one of them. The latter fact is untrue, and probably the first. She had no convictions for prostitution, and if she was making good money from the GIs, it seems odd she would need to turn to Christie to make ends meet. So he was probably slurring her character to make himself look less bad. However, unlike the earlier statement, he is explicit that he killed her and explains how. To continue with the statement, however, I was released from the War Reserve in December 1943 and started work at Ultra Radio, Park Royal. I got friendly with a woman named Edie, who was about 30. She used to live at Putney. I took this woman and her man-friend to Rillington Place and introduced them to my wife. They came several times together and had tea, and on one occasion we all went to the pictures together. On one occasion she came alone. I believe she complained of catarrh, and I said I thought I could help her. She came by appointment when my wife was out. I believe my wife was on holiday. I think I mixed some stuff up, some inhalants. Friar's balsam was one. She was in the kitchen, and at the time she was inhaling with a square scarf over her head. I remember now, it was in the bedroom. The liquid inhalant was in a square glass jar with a metal screw top lid. I had made 2 holes in the lid, and through one of the holes I put a rubber tube from the gas into the liquid. Through the other hole I put another rubber tube about 2 feet long. The tube didn't touch the liquid. The idea was to stop what was coming from smelling of gas. She inhaled the stuff from the tube. I did make her dopey. She became sort of unconscious, and I have a vague recollection of getting a stocking and tying it round her neck. I am not too clear about this. I have got them confused. It may have been the Austrian girl I used the gas on. I don't think it was both. I believe I had intercourse with her at the time I strangled her. I think I put her in the wash house. That night I buried her in the garden on the right-hand side, nearest the yard. She was still wearing her clothing. This statement is quite illuminating, as it is a description of how Christie committed this and his last 3 murders. It also shows how he lured his victim to his house. As if all this was not enough, Christie made another statement to the police concerning another murder he claimed he committed. This took place in November 1949, and the victim was his fellow tenant, Beryl Evans. Christie alleged that she wished to commit suicide, and he agreed to help her in return for sex. He went to her room, and so he said, I got on my knees but found I was not physically capable of having intercourse with her, owing to the fact that I had fibrositis in my back and enteritis. We were both fully dressed. I turned the gas tap on, and as near as I can make out, I held it close to her face. When she became unconscious, I turned the tap off. I was going to try again to have intercourse with her, but it was impossible. I couldn't bend over, I think that's when I strangled her. I think it was a stocking I found in the room. The gas wasn't on very long, not much over a minute, I think. Perhaps 1 or 2 minutes. I then left her where she was. This is clearly an inaccurate account for several reasons. The post-mortem examination on the corpse revealed no telltale marks of pink on the skin, which is evidence of gassing. Nor did an exhumation in 1953. Christie makes no reference to the blows found inflicted on the body either. The 4 corpses found in the house showed no such signs. Had there been an attack of this nature, Beryl would have cried out, and at that time the house was full of people, workmen and Ethel Christie. Without gas, it is hard to see how such a physically weak, middle-aged man of sedentary occupation could have killed a young woman fighting for her life, and it is impossible that he could have done so silently. This assumes that Beryl was even in the house at the time, for there is good evidence that she was out with her baby in the pram, as is common for young mothers. Peter Thorley was Beryl's younger brother and a frequent visitor to see his sister at 10 Rillington Place. Apart from enjoying tea and sticky buns, playing cards and discussing contemporary events with the friendly Christies, he enjoyed seeing his elder sister and his niece Geraldine. She told him that her husband was a drunken, violent lout who often knocked her about so much that Peter was very worried about his sister's safety. She even gave him her wedding ring on the grounds that her husband would just sell it to buy booze. He has no doubts about Evans's guilt, which has been backed up by those who have carefully investigated the case. Yet Christie, like Hay, probably felt the need to add to his body count in order to seem insane and thus save his own life. Adding more victims to his total would not complicate his case and could even help it. As he said, the more the merrier. Christie was tried for the murder of his wife at the Old Bailey on the 22nd of June, 1953, and the trial lasted for 4 days. His barrister, Derek Curtis Bennett, was paid for by the Sunday Pictorial in return for an exclusive story by Christie. As in the case of Hay, the defense did not lead with a plea of not guilty, but one of guilty but insane. This was a high-profile case which attracted immense public interest. The Attorney General led the case for the prosecution on the charge that Christie murdered his wife. Numerous witnesses came forward and were questioned to establish that there was a great deal of circumstantial evidence to show that Christie had indeed committed the crime. Gladys Langford followed the trial, noting that the evidence of the court shows Christie to have been a most bestial man. I shouldn't be surprised if the jurors will be so nauseated by the accounts of Christie's doings that they will find him guilty and turn down the plea of insanity. He is clearly not normal, and if hanged will be of little loss to the community. The prosecution showed that Christie had concealed his wife's death from family and neighbors. He had taken money from her bank account, but otherwise acted rationally. Under examination, he was asked, "You knew perfectly well at the time that you had done something wrong, and that you must not be found out if you could help it." He replied with a typically evasive and hazy answer, "Well, I do not know." He was then asked, "Christie, if on the 14th of December when you killed your wife in the bedroom, there had been a policeman there, you would not have done it, would you?" His answer scuppered his case. "I don't suppose so. That's obvious." Dr. Jack Hobson, psychiatrist at the Middlesex Hospital, then gave evidence for the defense, arguing that Christie had been suffering from mental disease since his wartime injuries in 1918. 2 psychiatrists were put up by the prosecution to rebut Hobson's arguments, arguing that he was a highly abnormal character rather than a victim of disease. After the closing speeches and the judges summing up, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They were away from the court for 80 minutes, and so, unlike the jury at Hay's trial, there was clearly some debate over the verdict. On the jury's return, the foreman gave the unanimous decision that Christie was guilty. When asked if he had anything to say, Christie said nothing. Once Christie had been found guilty, his fate was sealed. There was, as with Hay, no appeal. He was, however, questioned by John Scott Henderson, a barrister who was conducting an inquiry concerning a possible miscarriage of justice over whether Timothy Evans had killed his wife and child. As Gladys Langford wrote, it seems unlikely there could have been two stranglers in one house. Christie refused to give a straight answer. He was also questioned over a child murder, that of Christine Butcher in Windsor in 1952, which he denied having anything to do with. Christie seemed to have a very limited knowledge that he had done anything wrong. Writing a note to his wife's relatives, he put an apology for any trouble I may have brought about. Christie was hanged by Albert Pierrepoint at Pentonville Prison on the morning of the 15th of July, 1953. A huge crowd waited outside the prison to see the notice of execution be attached to the prison gates. His corpse was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison grounds, and a waxwork of him appeared at Madame Tussaud's waxworks, and one was still there until at least 2012. Rillington Place was renamed Ruston Close in 1954, before its demolition in the 1970s. The site today, rebuilt and remodeled, is known as Bartle Road. 3 further questions are worth asking. Why did Christie commit the murders? How did he do so? And how did he evade the law for nearly 10 years? Christie did not commit his murders for monetary gain, nor for any personal reason. He was not a sadist, for his victims, other than Ruth Feuerst and Mrs. Christie, were unconscious when he strangled them. The roots of his murderous desires seemed to stem from his adolescent years, as he described in his story in the Sunday Pictorial. The teenage years are when most people first become attracted to the opposite sex, and perhaps have their first sexual experiences. These are often difficult and embarrassing times. This was certainly the case for Christie. As with his fellows in Halifax, he was certainly eager for sexual encounters. Unfortunately, when he did meet a girl willing to have sex with him, he was unable to perform. This story got about his fellows, and he was a laughingstock and was known as No Dick Reggie. This humiliation made him feel inferior and created in him a hatred for women. Christie stated, "All my life since I have had this fear of appearing ridiculous as a lover," and said he was doubtful of my own sexual capabilities, and these fears became very real doubts. The other facet of Christie's nature was a fascination with death. As a boy of 11, when he had seen the corpse of his maternal grandfather, David Halliday, laid out on a table prior to burial, he had an awe and pleasure in seeing the body. "I was not in any way worried or perturbed," Christie stated. "All my life I never experienced fear or horror at the sight of a corpse. On the contrary, I have seen many, and they hold an interest and fascination over me." His war service in 1918 and his police service during the Blitz would have led to him seeing numerous dead bodies of those who had died violently. Thus, Christie had a fascination for sex and death. What he wanted was power over women, power that he was unable to exert in any other way. His jobs were all of a lowly nature, despite his intelligence. He certainly enjoyed the murders, writing that after his first, "She looked more beautiful in death than in life. And I remember, as I gazed down on the still form of my first victim, experiencing a strange, peaceful thrill. He may have killed originally on the spur of the moment, but finding he liked murder, he could not desist and would continue. After killing Muriel," he wrote, "once again I experienced that quiet, peaceful thrill. I had no regrets." Christie often tried to portray himself as essentially peaceful and gentle, writing, "I gave them a merciful end. The mob should remember that." But in other words, he comes across as quite the opposite. He wrote of the drunken Kathleen Maloney, "If ever a woman deserved to die, you do." When in prison, he wrote, "You can't help feeling that women who gave you the come on wouldn't be so smug if helpless or dead. and animals and birds are my friends. Women, well, that's different. Doctors interviewed him and studied him. As one psychiatrist remarked, his crimes were committed to ward off acute feelings of fear produced in him by women. Dr. Matheson, a prison doctor, wrote, "He has, I think, to render a woman with whom he was going to have intercourse unconscious before he began, lest he prove impotent and again subject to jeers, and have it revealed once more that sexually he was not a normal man. Having done it murder once and not been found out, it tempted him to repeat the act." The only exception to this general rule was when he murdered his wife. Christie wanted to kill again, but after the coming of peace in 1945, his wife remained at home for most of the time, preventing him bringing anyone back to kill. Sadly, Ethel's days were numbered, and after her death, he wrote, "After she was gone, the way was clear for me to fulfill my destiny," which is putting it too strongly, but the sentiment is clear. So how did Christie kill? Christie's statements to the police on the 31st of March do not provide an adequate explanation of his technique for murder. There are, however, other clues from women who survived their visits to number 10, from pathologists and from Christie's own later writings. Christie did not look threatening. He appeared smartly dressed, respectable, and polite. There was nothing in his looks to denote danger. Secondly, he was intelligent and had enough of a smattering of knowledge about medicine and the law to impress the average laywoman. He played on these strengths to lure women back to his home, always when his wife was absent or dead, working on their needs which he claimed he could fulfill, such as ill health in the case of Muriel Adey. He wrote, "My knowledge of medicine made it possible for me to talk convincingly about sickness and disease, and she readily believed that I could cure her." He went to places such as snack bars, cafes, and pubs where he could meet women. He met Ruth Forrest, Kathleen Maloney, and Rita Nelson in such places. The evidence of Mrs. Forrest is also important in understanding his technique. He told her at the Panda Cafe in March 1953 that he could cure her migraine, as he was a doctor who had been struck off for abortion. They arranged for her to visit him, but she failed to make the appointment, and when he saw her again, she said she was no longer interested. When he met Mary O'Neill, he invited her back to his flat with promises of money, but insisted, "Come along just after dark. I don't want anyone to see you, and don't tell anyone you are coming." Fortunately, once there, she told Christie her husband knew where she was, so Christie got up and muttered to himself. She left, unmolested. Not every woman he approached went along with him. Kathleen McCallum was approached by him, and he offered her accommodation, but she said, "I walked away as I did not like his looks." Another potential victim declined his offers. "I was suspicious of him," she later said. Gas was crucial to Christie. Physically weak, he needed to render his victims unconscious before he could use them, as he would and then kill them. Contrary to popular opinion, judging by the evidence of his last 3 victims, Christie was not a necrophile, a man who enjoyed sexual intercourse with the dead, as Gladys Langford put it. Quite how he persuaded his last 2 victims to inhale is another question, for though Kathleen was drunk, the other 2 were not, and this is impossible to answer satisfactorily, though without doubt they were gassed despite being sober. Christie claimed he would sit his victims down in the deck chair in the kitchen, and, as in the case of Rita Nelson, sitting nearby. "I removed the clip on the gas tube. I could see her eyes going a bit strange soon after. When they started getting overcome, that is when I must have strangled them." Finally, we turn to how Christie could commit murder for so long undiscovered. Christie's first 2 murders took place during the Second World War, as had Hayes' first 3. Murder in wartime was less likely to be detected, especially if there were no corpses to be located, because the police had many more tasks in upholding the numerous wartime regulations dealing with the general increase in crime, and the fact that bombing caused thousands of fatalities. Furthermore, with the young adults of the population being liable to be called up on war-related service, disappearances at short notice were not uncommon. Unless there was any suspicion of foul play, there was no reason to think that an adult's disappearance, which is not in itself an offense, needed an investigation. The disappearances of Ruth and Muriel were reported, but little or no action was taken, and there is no evidence that Christie was even suspected. It is unlikely that either woman told anyone where she was going. The fact that these murders took place in London gives them an anonymity that might not have been the case elsewhere. In 1939, London had a population of over 8 million people, a number it would not again reach until the 21st century. Some of that population was very transient, with people arriving often for work, moving about the capital, and then leaving. None of Christie's victims were born Londoners. One was Irish, one Scottish, one Austrian, and the English victims were all from the provinces. Also, none of the victims came from stable backgrounds. None lived in a family unit, and many lacked permanent employment. This meant that if they disappeared, they would not be missed, and might not even be reported as missing. Ruth lived by herself and had had numerous addresses and employments over the past 4 years. Kathleen was an orphan and unmarried. She had gone to London, but had not put down roots in her life as a prostitute, and she had no fixed abode. Rita was from Ireland. She had a cousin and a sister in London, but only saw the latter once and lost touch with her cousin after arriving. She had several short-lived menial jobs. Ectorina had left her family to live with Alexander Baker, who had left his wife. Her brother said that he knew nothing of his sister's private life. No one reported the disappearance of Ethel, Kathleen, or Hectorina. Ethel's family in Sheffield did nothing about her silence following her lack of communication in December 1952, though she had corresponded with her sister for many years. Unanswered letters were not followed up, and because there was no telephone at Rillington Place, there was no easy way to keep in touch. Sadly, no family members came to check. Therefore, when these 6 women disappeared, no one knew that Christie had any involvement in their deaths at all. Furthermore, since he was able to conceal the corpses in his back garden, under the floorboards and in the cupboard in the kitchen, no one knew that murder had occurred, as in the case of Hayes' victims. No body means no murder investigation in these cases. Of course, corpses decompose and smell, but Christie attempted to cover his tracks by liberally using Jay's disinfection liquid. He had few visitors, and for those who did come and noticed the smell, he told them that this was because of the insanitary habits of the other residents of the house, an explanation they accepted. Neighbors kept themselves to themselves and failed to notice women arriving, but never leaving. Even fellow inhabitants of 10 Rillington Place minded their own business and were not noticing people. Franklin Stewart told police, "I have not heard any knockings or unusual noises in the house." Ivan Williams told them likewise. "I have only met Christie on one occasion and have no idea who may have visited him or who was supposed to live with him. I have never heard any suspicious noises from the flat or anything to cause suspicion." Christie once wrote that he aimed to kill 10 women. He killed 6 in all from 1943-53. He was self-righteous and conceited. Yet his end became inevitable. Out of work and having sold all his and his wife's possessions, he could not remain at 10 Rillington Place forever. He had satisfied his lusts by first disposing of his wife, and then, master of the 3 squalid rooms, went on a killing spree, killing 3 women in less than 2 months. But it could not last. He would have to leave the place, and when he did, it would not be long before his victims' corpses were found, and when they were, he would be hunted down. He ignored what his reason must have told him would be the long-term result, preferring to indulge his desires in the short term. Killing and disposing of corpses in one's own property is a short-term solution, as there are unlikely to be any witnesses in either event, but to leave them there means eventual discovery. Doing the same deeds elsewhere is dangerous in the short term, but safer in the long term. He would be hunted down. He ignored what his